afternoon, everybody. We'll just give maybe one more minute. I see folks are continuing to join. Great. Well, we have a packed agenda. So in the interest of time, I'm going to get started. My name is Romy Drucker, and I'm the Interim Director of the Education Program at the Walton Family Foundation. I want to thank reporters and also our partners on the call today for joining today's briefing on Bellwether's new report, The Overlooked. This report, which we're going to talk about and reflect on together over the next 40 minutes or so, provides us with a really in-depth understanding of the magnitude of parents' discontent with pre-pandemic educational options. It also sheds light on the problem-solving spirit that parents brought over these last 18 months to really ensuring that their children were learning in supportive environments in all ways. As the report highlights, over the last 18 months, 11.3 million children did not have access to the learning environments that they needed. What I'm excited about is that today's briefing will center the voices of several parents who chose learning environments over the last year or so that could better meet the needs of their children. These learning environments are more personalized and also better equipped to support the academic and social emotional needs of students. And we have Isis, Torlisha, and Stacy here with us today, and I'll be introducing them in a little while. Finally, I'll just note that I don't think this is a trend that's going away. What we're starting to see in terms of parents seeking out options that are more personalized and more catered to the learning styles of their children. And it shouldn't go away if we fundamentally believe that every student deserves access to a school or a learning option that can really unlock and realize his or her full potential. I'm going to hand it now over to Alex Spurrier from Bellwether, who's going to walk us through the data. And then, as I mentioned, I'm going to moderate a conversation with parents who are going to share their firsthand journeys over the last several years and over their time being parents about what their experience has been more recently. Alex is a senior analyst with Bellwether in the policy and evaluation practice and was a lead author on today's report that we're talking through. Thank you, Alex.
Thanks, Romy, and thank you everyone who's been able to join us on the call today. The Overlooked is our first look at how students' needs were not met during the past year and how families tried, if they could, to do the right thing for their children's circumstances. And the total, 11.3 million students, represents approximately 1 in 5 school-aged children in America. And I want to start just from a very high level and recognize that we're all pretty familiar, most likely, with the major trends that have happened in K-12 schooling since the onset of the pandemic. In early 2020, every school campus closed their doors for in-person instruction, and we had a massive shift to remote learning. By that fall, most schools for kids were still on remote, and we saw a gradual shift back to in-person instruction towards spring of this year. And now this fall, most schools are opening in person, and we're starting to see some schools actually closing back down due to the spread of the Delta variant. But what's being obscured by those high-level changes are two pretty fundamental shifts that have happened underneath the surface with parents. First, families changed what they prioritize for their kids' physical, mental, emotional, and academic development. And second, for the first time in modern history, every single parent in America had to consider a different educational setting for their children. School systems did what they could to adapt, but many lacked the organizational dynamism to meet family shifting needs. And we estimate that 11.3 million children did not get the education that they needed from K-12 schools over the past 18 months. They are the overlooked. And we break down the overlooked into 3 different categories. And these 3 categories of children represent a diverse range of communities across America, both in terms of race and ethnicity, as well as socioeconomic status. we break these down into the three categories of the movers, which are the 8.7 million children last year who switched the school that they attended. We also have the missed, the 1.1 million children who did not enroll in any formal schooling, be that a public school, a private school, or homeschooling. Um, they just simply did not enroll in any formal schooling option during the 2020-2021 school year. And then we have the muted. This is a population of children who aren't able to access the options that their parents would prefer for them, but they haven't been able to make a change in where they attend school yet. And the best representation of this group are the segment of students who are enrolled in districts that do not offer a virtual option right now, even though their parents might prefer one. And we estimate that to be approximately 1.5 million children across the country. Um, the muted also represent a trend of disparities in offerings of remote education to students. We've seen in a recent piece in The Atlantic by Adam Harris that districts that have higher percentages of non-white students are less likely to offer remote options this fall than districts that have higher percentages of non-Hispanic white students. When we look at other groups within the overlooked, if we go back to the movers, they are not just affluent suburban families that have switched from public schools into private schools. In fact, enrollment in both public school and private school sectors has declined from 2019-2020 to 2020-2021. And what we're seeing is a shift to smaller scaled, more personalized options for families. We've seen a growth in the number of students attending public charter schools. And we've also seen significant growth in homeschooling, learning pods, and micro schools. We also know that much of this growth is being driven by Black and Hispanic families. The strongest increases in homeschooling were among Black and Hispanic families. And we also know that from polling data, Black and Hispanic families are much more interested in learning pods and other alternative settings for their students than non-Hispanic white families. So what this all means is that there's a lot of children, again, 1 in 5 in the country, that weren't having their needs met by the traditional K-12 education system. Schools did what they could to respond, but again, many of them were not nimble enough to meet the changing needs of kids and families over the course of this pandemic. And so with that, it calls on policymakers and practitioners to change what they're doing to better meet the new needs of children and families in the wake of the pandemic. So that means creating the schools that families want, adjusting structures that will help families access those options, and doing more work to support students that may be on the margins. So with that, I'll pause and hand it off to my colleague, Julie Squire, who is also an author on this report, to offer some of her thoughts on this as well.
Thanks, Alex. So quickly, and I know we're eager to get to the rest of the discussion with parents. Fundamentally, our analysis is trying to quantify a challenge that predates the pandemic, but has become particularly acute during the pandemic. Families have many different needs and preferences, and many of them cannot find the options that they want for their children. So we are a large, diverse, pluralistic country. Families have many different needs and preferences. Regions across the country have experienced the last 18 months very differently, and we need a system of schools that can flex and adapt. So with that, I'll keep my remarks brief and hand it over to Romy.
Great. Well, I'm excited to have Torlisha Bates, Isis Span, and Stacy Walmsley here with us today. Let me do brief introductions for each of them. Isis is the CEO of Fundamentals of Learning. She resides in South Carolina and has 4 children spanning ages 2 through 10. Last year, she was a classroom teacher and also founded a math learning pod to serve families in the state of South Carolina and Virginia. We have Torlisha Bates, who lives outside Richmond, Virginia, and is the mother of 3 children spanning ages 3 to 11. She has a master's in theology and is a manager in the banking industry. And last year, Torlisha homeschooled her 2 older children and plans to participate in the Cultural Roots Homeschool Co-op this year. And Stacy Walmsley lives in Westchester, Pennsylvania, and is the mother of 2 children with special needs. She has 26 years of experience in the IT and tech sectors and is currently a director in digital at Pfizer. During the pandemic, Stacy worked with hundreds of parents who experienced the difficulties of remote learning and is going to share some of her reflections on that time today. So I am going to moderate and direct questions at each of you. Torlisha, we'll start with you. I'd love for you to start by telling us a little bit about your children and why you chose to homeschool your 2 oldest.
Sure. My kids are like any other 10-year-old, 8-year-old. They're energetic, they're social, they're outgoing, they're busy, right? But the reason I decided to pull them last year is, number one, I work at home. So I did not want to subscribe to the stress of keeping up with another virtual schedule. That's the first thing. The other thing is there was so much going on socially, and my kids are very in tune to the social climate and what's happening in the world. And so I was not confident that the school would be able to address some of the emotional needs that come with that. And I considered homeschooling before. So last year with the COVID happening, the social rise and upset was the push that I needed to take the leap.
Thank you for sharing that reflection. Stacy, I want to ask you about the change you made mid-year for your son. Why did you decide to switch things up?
Hi. Both my children struggled with remote learning, but my oldest was actually injured at school and got a concussion and was medically restricted from any type of devices that would be the hallmark of any form of remote learning, and was shocked to find that our public school system refused him access to in-person education. He was restricted for over 3 months. Their offerings were that he could just be excused for an entire trimester. He was 10 years old at the time and in 5th grade and preparing for middle school, but he also has a 504 and he's got a medical condition that affects his immune system. And he also has a sensory processing disorder associated with his hearing. And this is a child that they knew was in distress, that had medical needs, and they turned their back on him and they offered him nothing. We tried for over 6 weeks to mediate with the district and ultimately ended up withdrawing him and putting him in a private school 5 days a week in person. It took him an entire trimester to regain what he had lost in those 6 weeks. And he's already a child who works twice as hard for the same result. So to have that burden placed upon him when the district had the ability to bring him in. There were other children brought in with much less need, whether it was medical or emotional. So for them to just deny him was heartbreaking. So that's my older son's story.
Thank you for sharing. Isis, let's turn to you and tell us a little bit about your 4 children and their educational experience over this last year.
Yeah, of course. So good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where your time zone is. My children, I have twin daughters that are 10 years old. So last year they were in the 4th grade. And then my daughter is 3 years old and my son at the time was only 1 year old. My story is a little bit different because I was also a pandemic teacher. So my children had to go inside of a school building because I had to go inside of a school building and their dad didn't work from home. My issue was that I was putting a lot on myself as an educator to make sure that they were getting what they were supposed to get instead of holding the school accountable. So last year was my big accountability push to say, hey, I'm doing blended and traditional learning right now with 16 students. I don't have the capacity to check behind and make sure that you guys are doing what you're supposed to do for my children. So I need these things that are spelled out to be done. I need you guys to make sure that my daughter, who's 10 years old, that's conquering cerebral palsy, has access to the playground, has access to the materials that she needs. They struggle with mathematics. I need you guys to make sure that you are using hands-on material for them as they're doing their math assignment. So last year for me was really holding the school accountable for what they were already supposed to be doing for my children and not feeling like as an educator, I had to take that on. And for my 3 and 1 year old, they were actually in a local childcare facility while my husband and I went to work. So none of my children were inside of the home last year for the 2020-2021 school year.
I hear all of you talking about the importance of finding a context that felt personalized for your children's needs and also for you and your schedules and routines. I want to come back to you, Torlisha, and probe a little bit more on how homeschooling has compared to your children's previous educational experience and what you've been able to design and integrate to make it more engaging and effective to your kids' learning styles.
Sure. First of all, it's given us time back. And that's the one thing that I have always struggled with, feeling like I was robbed of, because I'm a person that I heard the concerns of parents last year, and I respect that, but I actually like having my kids around and creating those memories. And I like being a part of their learning process. And that is honestly one of the things that I felt I was kind of limited in before. So it's given us the time back, right? The other thing that it's really given us is the liberty, because we're not isolated to a classroom. The classroom for us can be at the park. The classroom for us can be in the garden. And so I've really been able to flex our learning and the curriculum to what my child needs on a day-to-day basis. There were days where emotionally they were not there, right? And so we had to figure out another way to reach them. And I have the flexibility to do that. So I think the biggest two things that the other thing that I will say is that homeschooling is not just about, okay, let's hit this mark, let's hit this mark. It's a lifestyle. It has truly become a lifestyle for us. Anything that we're doing presents a learning opportunity. So for me, time and liberty are like key for what I feel is different from what they were getting in public school. And I'm speaking of time with us as the parents, being able to control and gauge what they're learning and the way that we're presenting the information to them.
I want to come back to you and ask you to talk a little bit about your experience leading a math learning pod and the ways in which you were able to provide opportunities to students that they didn't have before, how you utilized that time to really tailor different strategies to help kids accelerate.
Absolutely. So the math pod actually came out of frustration, honestly. I've been in the classroom for 10 years, so I know how important it is for math instruction to be taught intentionally. And when schools first shut down, I saw just in my neighbors and my nieces and nephews, this influx of worksheets and packets. And and let me clarify that my math pod is specifically for pre-K and kindergarten, because those are the ages where we can't afford for them to sit around and practice worksheets all day. And I knew that wasn't going to work because I've taught kindergarten for 6 years. They needed material. They needed hands-on material that they could touch and feel and move, and a packet wasn't going to get them there. So I started by doing math morning videos and going live on social media every morning for, what was that, 3 months, while my children were home with me. And then when I went into the classroom, parents started messaging me, hey, are you still going to do the videos? So I got the opportunity to receive a grant through the National Parents Union and the Vela Education Fund to actually do a math pod that I intentionally wanted to build for 36 weeks. Like, I didn't want it to be, I'm here for a month and then I'm gone and you're on your own. I wanted to be there throughout their entire kindergarten year, especially in that area of mathematics, because a lot of times that area is overlooked. And something that the pod provided for them that they weren't getting was that continual support. Like you're not on your own. If you have a question, I'm here. If you need to know how to use a resource, I created YouTube videos, and I was there to coach and consult with parents that still put their children in public schools, but they knew that they needed support, or they decided to do full-time homeschooling, but in their minds, they weren't a teacher, so they needed someone to be there with them. I had families that were in private schools, but they wanted their child to get more and to have more. And that's what that's what the math learning pod provided for them, because it was something that they needed.
Stacey, I want to come back to you. I mean, you, Torlisha, Isis, represent parents who were able to problem solve your way into creative opportunities, but not everyone was able to do that. And you've worked with lots of parents who didn't have the opportunity to either find a better context or a better solution. What is your sense of how others in your community fared and what you learned from conversations with fellow parents?
So first, I just want to give a shout out to my fellow panelists, because Torlisha and Isis, the stories that you've shared and the advocacy that you've done, how you've reimagined Isis, the way you do your work, and contributed to learning in your community, in addition to taking care of your children and your students. I can't thank you enough. My best friend's a teacher, so this is a trade that's near and dear to my heart. For my own children, I solved the situation for my older one. My younger son has a disability. I put him in a learning center to get the socialization that he needed, but he still struggled. I heard stories from across my district, families of various backgrounds, whether it was a variety of our ethnicity, a variety of our economic standing, everybody had the same struggle, the same frustration. We certainly felt muted, overlooked. How you guys articulate it in the report just really resonates with me. So myself, obviously I had the privilege of solving my children's problems, but I live in a community, I live in a school district that is a Title I district. That means 40% of our families. So a school district serving 12,000 plus students, 40% of our families don't make a living wage for our area. I had the privilege of working from home. I had the privilege of hiring help, and I had the privilege of sending my children where they needed to be. But 40% of the families in my community had to make a choice between their jobs and their kids getting education. In my community, I called it remote learning, forced remote learning, a solution by majority privilege, and we should never, ever rely on that to solve for education. It should have been accessible to everybody who needed it, who wanted it. And I was so determined to try to solve this problem, even if just for 15 students. I actually applied for a charter application in my community. So in my district, I actually proposed a charter micro school, which was a really unique way of trying to finance learning pods like Isis talked about. I mean, you mentioned getting a grant, but not everybody has those means and those opportunities, right? But by getting a charter designation for a micro school to support anywhere from 4 to 15 students, it would have been a pathway for families to activate choice. It would have been an equalizer in terms of public education and creating pathways of access for families who either couldn't afford options like I could, who didn't have the resources and support. Not everyone has extended family or friends to help them out. I mean, all the single parents out there who are the sole provider for their children and trying to juggle their jobs, their children. There were just so many of us desperate for solutions, and I wanted to do something more than just for my two. So I applaud all of you. Your stories really touch my heart, and I just want to thank you on behalf of the other moms and dads out there. Thank you for what you've done.
Well, that's a great segue to our last question, Stacey, which I want to have all of you answer, and you'll each have about a minute. And that is about what's possible going forward. We've heard your stories today. We know that every poll, a Walton poll, an EdChoice poll, a National Parents Union poll, overwhelmingly, polling over the last 18 months has suggested that parents are eager to see education reimagined, and that's a word that keeps coming up. So I'd love for you to reflect on what that means for you, what's possible, and advice you have for other parents and for policymakers as we all work together to figure out how to better serve students. And Isis, maybe we'll start with you, go to Stacy, and end with Torlisha.
Yes, absolutely. So my thing is always, and this is the educator, mom, advocate in me answering this question, representing all those different groups and all those different children. It's really going to start with our mindset. It's going to start with how we think about education. It's going to start with how we think about children. And we know we have multiple, mindsets, and we all think differently, but we have to first recognize that children are not okay. They haven't been okay for the last 18 months. Black and brown families haven't been okay before the pandemic. And there's this notion that, okay, there's nothing that we can do for all children. And that's absolutely not the case. There is something small that each and every one of us can do, whether it's bringing in new and exciting ideas that are funded, like Kindergarten Counts learning pods, whether it is joining homeschool organizations where your child can meet with an educator to help them, whether it's private, whether it's coming into your home. Now is the time where a lot of ears are open. And now is the time where a lot of wallets and pockets seem to be open as well. So we can't be afraid to push different ideas, and we can't be afraid to push the numbers and the data that shows that children and families are not okay. And we have the resources to do something about it, but do we have the willpower to do something about it?
Thank you for that.
I don't know what I can say better than that, Isis. What I will ask, my plea for everyone hearing this, whether you be a parent, a guardian, an educator, a school board director, the media, we need to open our ears, we need to open our minds, and we need to open our hearts. We need to not minimize the pain of others. This is not as simple as being resilient or having a positive attitude. Parents advocating for their children, especially those of us who have children with disabilities. I mean, my 9-year-old son has a disability since he was born. He fought to speak, and at the age of 4, he was mute. The pain I feel on his behalf, I mean, I don't let that hang out every day, right? Like, we have gotten him to where he is through positivity, through resilience. He has overcome so much. And I see that reflected in my community and across this nation. So what we all need to do is just take a moment to acknowledge each other. Not everyone has the same story. We need to listen to each unique one, and we need to find a way to meet families and children where they are. And that is the point of education choice. That is the most equalizing thing we can do, is to empower families to not be constrained by their geography, by their economic means, and to make education accessible to every child in the way that suits them. No judgment, no conditions. It's as simple as that, and we don't need the education system to over-articulate on this. It's about access to education, and we need to work with the parents to find the best solutions for our children and our students.
I agree. I would definitely echo everything that both you ladies have said. I completely agree with it. I think the biggest thing for me, if I could encourage anybody, is to take the leap. Whatever that means for you, in whichever way that means you show up for your kid, right? Or your children, because it's just like if you go to the doctor, no doctor knows the patient's body than the patient, right? Because we've lived in this body. So it's the same thing with your children. You are their first teachers. You are their first advocates. You are their first cheerleaders. I was so afraid of taking the leap for homeschooling because I didn't feel that I would be able to give them an adequate education that public school would be able to offer them. And I was listening to a YouTube webinar a few weeks ago, and this lady said something so profound. She said, instead of questioning whether you're adequate enough to teach your kids, question the system that told you were not adequate enough. And that was so encouraging and inspiring to me, because I'm telling you, nobody wants my kids to succeed more than I want my kids to succeed. So if that means that I'm reaching across the aisle for educators to come in and give me insight, or reaching across the aisle for them to attend a learning pod, I'll do what I have to do to make sure they get what they need. So I just would encourage anybody that's listening, if you see that there's a gap, don't sit back, don't be silent. You go to war for your kids, whatever that means. You show up, you make sure that your presence is known, and you make sure that change is going to happen, because we don't have another moment to wait. We've been waiting. Isis said it best. Now is the time, and you have to do something right now so that our kids are not continuing to suffer.
For Alicia, Stacy, Isis, thank you so much for being open-hearted with us today and sharing so candidly about your families and your journeys. We really, really appreciate you. I'm going to hand it over now to Manny Rivera for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Romy. And thank you again to our parent panelists for sharing your perspectives and powerful insights. My name is Manny Rivera. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I will be providing the moderating our Q&A portion today. And I wanted to note to folks that following this conversation today, we will be sharing a deck to all call attendees with additional high-level detail from today's report. For the Q&A portion, all attendee lines have been placed on mute to allow for an orderly process. If you would like to submit a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. When submitting a question, please include your name and organization or outlet, and whom you would like to direct your question to among our panelists. We'll take as many questions as we can, but if we do not get to your question during the call, we will be following up with you directly. We'll pause for the first question to populate. Okay, our first question is directed to Alex with Bellwether. The question is, do you have a sense of what is driving parents away from enrolling their children in schools? Is it fear of sickness, political motivations, educational effectiveness, or something else?
Well, thank you for that question. And I think the answer is there are a lot of different reasons. And as you heard from the parents on this panel, parents aren't a monolith, and the reasons that they have for switching the environment their child is learning in varies from parent to parent and family to family. That being said, we do have some data in a recent poll that was released by Beacon Research in partnership with the Walton Family Foundation today that shows the reasons that families have stated for why they've switched schools. And among the top reasons are to find a better learning environment for their child, one that is better suited to their individualized learning needs. COVID concerns are also driving some of the switch. And I think, last year when most schools were closed to in-person instruction, there were a lot of families that wanted some form of in-person option for their child and sought out smaller scaled settings like learning pods to minimize COVID risk while still finding an option that worked for their children. This year, we're seeing the opposite of that happen. We're seeing families with immunocompromised children who want a virtual option being stuck because their district isn't offering one at this time. So as I mentioned, the reasons for movement between schools or a desire for a different option are varied, but the clear call here is that policymakers and education leaders can be doing and should be doing a lot more to respond to these new preferences that families have that are significantly different than they were in 2019 and in the pre-pandemic era. I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you so much, Alex. We do have another question specifically about the report. Does the report cover how enduring these attitudes or the shifts that are covered in the report might be?
So we don't cover how enduring these shifts might be, but I would just underscore that we've never quite been in a time like this. As I mentioned at the outset, this is the first time in history where every parent in the country had to consider what are they going to need to get their kid in order for them to do well or as well as they can during the course of the pandemic, and adapting to those circumstances. Parents were able to do different things and had different responses. We have the movers who were able to change the school that their children were attending. We had some families that didn't enroll their children in school at all. Those would be the missed. And then we have the muted, those who are still struggling to get access to the options that they want. And so I think the jury is still out in terms of like how long term these changes will be. But I think that there's a likelihood that they will persist in some form. And even if it's just a portion of these 11.3 million families, it's still a significant change to a lot of school systems or that systems will need to make to meet the needs of these millions of families moving forward.
And one other follow-up question on that. You mentioned the movers, the muted, and the missed. What's the approximate breakdown among each group?
I actually can, if you enable me to share my screen, I can pull up a table that would allow me to show that. But the breakdown is for the movers, it's 8.7 million. Oh, I've got the ability to share my screen now, so I'll go ahead and do that. The missed are 1.1 million and the muted are 1.5 million. So let me just pop this into the slideshow so that you can see that a little bit more clearly.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Alex. And just to reiterate for folks, we will be circulating this deck to attendees after the call has concluded. And just a reminder for folks, if you'd like to submit a question, please submit it through the Q&A function in the chat box. And we will be taking questions again as they come in. The next question is for our parent panelists. And the question is, given what you've experienced and done over the past year, what additional support do you wish school districts could provide to better support your children and other parents? Perhaps Isis, we can start with you.
Absolutely. To support my 4 children, this is always a tough question for me because I'm an educator and I feel like I could just do all things. But I know when they get to middle and high school, I'm going to need a lot more help. But for my 4 children, I would love for schools to see my children as I see them. I would love for them to know that my 4-year-old really likes to cook. Can we have a chef visit? Can we have cooking classes? My 2-year-old really likes to put things together. Are there opportunities for him to do that throughout the day? My 10-year-olds really like to sing and write music. Is there an opportunity other than 45 minutes of enrichment for them to actually be themselves more? So the educator side of me would love for school districts to actually give educators the flexibility to meet students where they are. We talk a lot about personalized learning, but we miss the person part of that. And we can't cookie cut personalized learning. Those two things can't go together. And just for other children, their families really need a lot of coaching and someone to be there with them. Like I would love for every parent, every group of parents to have a mentor, to have someone where they can bounce ideas off of and to understand. This will be my last thing. It's a lot of things I want for them to do, but this will be my last thing. For them to understand that families also have to clothe, feed, and educate the children. So we have to think about all of these hats that families wear and how we can pick up some of the weight for them. Those would be my things.
Great, thank you, Isis. Stacy?
So my wish really probably started before even the pandemic, and that is I wished that the school system did not force children to struggle and fail before it put out a hand of help. Both my children have been denied services, have been denied 504s or IEPs because their need just wasn't great enough, meaning they had to become deficient, they had to struggle, they had to fall behind in order to get caught up versus recognizing the fact that they inherently had a challenge. I mean, again, my youngest son has a disability. His speech apraxic, that is a medical condition. It's not developmental. He never grows out of this. He will have this disability his entire life, and yet they continue to force him to suffer, to struggle. He now needs 3 specialists as a result of even doing a mask accommodation last year, right? So I'm not getting into like whether or not it's about mass. It's about the fact that he had a child with a communication disability and you did damage to him and you knew that. And they put him in counseling. They actually offered him a counselor from our intermediate unit. And it took 4 months of counseling with that counselor until that counselor said his single most biggest stressor is remote learning. And then they invited him back 4 days a week, but they let him struggle for over 4 months until a mental health professional had to say he needs to be in person. I'm his mother. I knew he needed to be in person. And instead of recognizing that, they ignored me, they belittled me, they mocked me for not being positive enough. And they forced my child to struggle, and he continues to overcome the damage of that year. And I just feels for every family whose child has had to fall behind in order to have the education system reach out a helping hand. We need to do better, and we need to not punish children in order to qualify them to be met where they are.
Thank you, Stacy. And Torlisha?
Well, I think a mouthful has been said for sure. I definitely echo Isis on the enrichment. My daughter is a busybody. She's been a busybody since she was born. And so in a classroom setting, that doesn't always work, right? Because she's the dancer, she's the singer, she's a hands-on kind of learner. And so I do wish there were other options other than having to sit for long periods of time. And if she doesn't fall into that category, then she's labeled. I'm not going to medicate her. I'm not gonna, go into the ADHD mode. And I don't have a problem with people who do, but I'm just saying I've found ways to be able to channel that energy. And I wish we were able to do a little bit more of that with the public school instead of kind of categorizing some kinds, certain kids with different behaviors. The other thing that I would really love to see is I would like to kind of see the bridge between public school and homeschooling, because I think that as a homeschooling parent, there are some really cool things that parents can bring to the table that would help if for some reason, our kids ever transition back into public school. So I really would kind of see us bridge some of the gap and come to the table together to figure out how we could fortify a community that really benefits our children.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have today for Q&A. For those of you whose questions we did not get to, we will be following up offline to connect with you and get you some answers. If you do have a question but did not submit it through the Q&A function, please don't hesitate to reach out through the contact in the media advisory advising this call. And again, we will make sure and connect you with answers or potential interviews. Now I'd like to turn the call over to Romy Drucker to close us out. Romy?
Great. Well, thank you again to everyone for joining today, especially to Isis, Stacy, and Torlisha. And we look forward to continuing the conversation with everybody over the coming weeks and months. And thank you. It was great to learn together today.
Thank you.